Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think if we can make a start, please. Firstly, I have two announcements. Firstly, when we originally planned this event, it wasn't entirely inevitable that a tube strike would take place today. Unfortunately, it has. And I'm sure that, I know that some people who might otherwise have been here have been unable to come. Unfortunately, that also applies to one of our speakers, Juliana Barbosa, who unfortunately met with an accident on her way to the airport yesterday, and although she is fortunately unharmed, she did miss her flight, so can't unfortunately be with us today. However, in the best IISS tradition, the show goes on, and we're going to carry on addressing this this event, a very important issue. About a year ago, I was asked to endorse a book by David Kilcullen, well-known expert on insurgency, entitled Out of the Mountains. And David's basic proposition was that insecurity and conflict tends to take place where people increasingly are in cities, and a potential counter-insurgency model for the future would be focused on large littoral megacities that were very difficult to control. And in the case of Rio de Janeiro, I think we have a paradigm which closely conforms to that, a situation in which the planned city and an unplanned city that is often not governed by any recognizable institutions of state have to try and coexist, and the challenges of dealing with that have been something that has regularly made the international headlines. To talk about this and to look at the issues associated with this particular set of problems, we've got two speakers. Antonio Sampaio, who is part of the home team, Research Associate for Security and Development here at IISS, and a former resident of Rio de Janeiro. I don't know where his suntan went, he has been working on issues of criminal violence and insecurity in Latin America here at the Institute. We also have Christoph Harig, who is a doctoral researcher at the Brazil Institute at King's College London, just across the road, and he has looked at Brazil's contribution to peacekeeping and the connection between that, internal deployments of Brazil's armed forces, and the way in which Brazil's military develops capability to undertake, and other militaries to undertake policing tasks in this peacekeeping contest. So, without further ado, I will. Sorry, I should have introduced myself first. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Nigel Inkster. I'm the Director of Transnational Threats and Political Risk here at IISS. Excuse me. I'll invite each of our speakers to speak for slightly longer than they were originally planning to do, and then I will open up the discussion for comments and questions. This event is on the record in its entirety. I simply ask that if you do want to make a question or comment before doing so, you please tell us who you are and what your affiliation is. So with that, I will turn over to Antonio to kick us off.
Thanks a lot, Nigel. Thank you for coming, for making it. And I think it's, in a perverse way, it's kind of an appropriate background of urban chaos and insecurity that we are doing this. I want to start by saying that Juliana Barbassa, I think her forthcoming book, is a hugely important piece for this field of urban insecurity. Is a case study of Rio. It's not solely focused on the Pacification program or security, but I think nonetheless is a very important addition. It's called Dancing with the Devil in the City of God. So the case of Rio de Janeiro. The reason I say that is because I think Rio is still an understudied case of urban security policies, despite being very prominent in the media all the time in the context of the Olympic Games in 2016. So last year I read with great interest the autobiography by José Mariano Beltrami, Security Secretary of Rio de Janeiro and the father of the Pacification program. And it struck me that how much overlap there is between his writing and the literature on counter-insurgency and stabilization, the English language literature on that, without him making any references to it. And so I think these two audiences, they don't talk to each other. But I think there are some very interesting similarities or cross lessons. And I think Christoph will be able to provide some of them. Since Juliana is not here, I just want to make a very brief introduction of what the Pacification program in Rio is. I might miss a few things because I wasn't planning to do so Christoph might be able to correct me, and some even more informed people that I know are in the audience. So the previous approach before 2008, when the Pacification program started, was one of occasional raids by the military police, and especially by its Special Operations Brigade, the BOP, Batalhão de Operações Policiais Especiais, into the favelas, into the slums, with this very ugly, square, gray metal thing called the caveirão, the big skull, which is an armored vehicle without anything else besides this hull, any weapon or anything, but there are holes in it in which the military police officers can stick their rifles in order to enter this highly dense urban environment and shoot at the criminal gangs that ambush them in the narrow alleys of the slums. And so the military police used to enter in raids to capture or kill a specific drug lord or to tackle a specific crisis in a specific slum area, and then exit almost always on the same day or stay for a few weeks or something, and then exit that area. So Beltrami describes the Pacification as a logic to implode the power of drug trafficking by shaking its territorial structure. So that is just one example of how similar I think that the Pacification program can come to the counter-insurgency logic of conquering and holding territory through population support and development. So it became very famous and gained international headlines in 2010 when they made the first move into one of the mega slums in Rio with over 100,000 inhabitants, the case of the Alemão complex, in which I'm sure Christoph will talk more about that, but just to show you how it came to become a brand in Rio and outside Rio. They made a surprise move into the Alemão slum, and then the criminals broke and ran, and that was broadcast live on TV, and that was one of the main victories against drug trafficking. For the first time, the drug gangs actually exited a territory in face of a security detachment entering that territory. So it also became associated with the ceremonies of the police when it entered and conquered the slums of raising the Brazilian flag on the top of the slums. Almost all the slums in Rio are in hills. It's a very hilly city. So they plant the flag in proclamation of its territorial control, which again logically makes us conclude that beforehand there was an unspoken acceptance that that territory wasn't under territorial control of the state. And it wasn't just a doctrinal change. The numbers also showed a significant change. I studied by the State University of Rio de Janeiro by the sociologist Inácio Cano showed that violent deaths in the occupied slums fell by 75% in comparison to the months before the arrival of the UPP. And there are some very interesting studies about the area effect on the outskirts of the slums in which violent crime also decreased. So it's still under study. I mean, they studied some slums and the broad geographical impact of the pacification, but I think it's also worth mentioning that the impact of the pacification wasn't just in the slums, it was in the entirety of the city, and especially on the outskirts of the slum. So that was a very brief introduction to the pacification program. I think one of the reasons we are here is that the lessons of Rio tend to become more important to other areas of the world. After all, Latin America is one of the most heavily urbanized regions of the world, with approximately 80% of its population living in cities. All the developing regions are still far behind that. But a key trend for the coming decades, and one that Nigel referred to, and I'm sure that some of you might have heard, is that some other developing regions, such as Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, are facing very rapid urban population growth. So I think there are plenty of potentially transferable policy lessons from megacities, dense megacities such as Rio, and other Latin American cities such as Medellin, Colombia, to other developing regions of the world. So after all these, during these years of urban warfare, gang warfare, I think the population acquired an overall lack of trust in the capacity of the security authorities to provide direction for this chaos in the city. And what makes the pacification program so different is the fact that there was establishment of a combination of development tools with hard security elements as a central and long-term commitment by the authorities. And I say this is bold because it's an expensive and labor-intensive approach, which has required sustained effort and significant expenditure of political capital during these past 7 years, including with political coordination on the federal level between municipal, state level. So Rio de Janeiro City is the capital of Rio de Janeiro State. So municipal, state, and federal levels for the support by the armed forces, for instance. So at the center of this long story of urban insecurity in Rio is the military police force. And I'd like to focus a little bit on this particular character. It is at the core of any security initiative, any important operation or attempted reform in security policies in Rio. The name itself symbolizes the ambiguity in pursuing security policies in a chaotic megacity. The military police is not part of the armed forces, but follows some of its structure, discipline, training, and weapons. It is used extensively on a daily basis for law enforcement in dangerous peripheries, rapid response, or the invasion of a particularly dangerous slum. So just to have an idea of how different it is from classic functions of a police force, particularly classic in developed regions such as Western Europe, the military police does not have any focus on criminal investigation, which is the responsibility of the civilian police, a much lighter force in terms of weaponry. The military police emerged in the early 19th century by the Portuguese authorities during the colonial era as a force of repression, and again assumed some of those duties during the military dictatorship that ran from 1960s to the 1980s in Brazil as a force of repression. And it evolved into a primary tool for a semi-permanent state of urban warfare in Rio. Not surprisingly, it is considered one of the top forces in the world for urban warfare by a number of military literature, and well, there are some known positive aspects to that as well, in which Human Rights Watch reported some years ago that it was also one of the deadliest forces in the world. For good or evil, some of its practices are widely popularized in the Elite Squad films that some of you might have watched. And the officers also take pride in the fact that the Brazilian army units look to them for training, not the other way around. And as I said, the Special Operations Brigade, BOP, is a highly elite force in urban warfare, and its emblem, its insignia, is a skull with two guns crossing it and a knife going through it from the top under a black background. So a symbol of the kinetic aspect of this force. And the reason I think that the military police is so important to understand the current pacification strategy comes from my chat with Colonel Robson Rodrigues, who is the head of the military police. He's a very outspoken and clear about what he's trying to achieve and the limitations of what he's trying to achieve. He's also one of the founding strategists of the Pacification program. He told me about 2 months ago that his main goal right now is to transition from a military police with colonial era repressive outlook to a proximity policing outlook. This is a long-term goal. It doesn't mean that they want to do it now, but that is the goal that they are looking at. And this is part of a broader dilemma facing security strategists in Rio. The urban warfare element that has become an essential tool to secure territories from criminal gangs is also turning the population against the public forces. And this challenge is not only related to institutional or bureaucratic hurdles in making this shift from urban warfare to proximity policing, but also to a strategic situation in Rio in which at least 3 heavily armed organized criminal groups are vying for power and territory. The state of affairs, as I could gather in early April during my trip, is that they are currently experimenting with ways to keep both types of policing at the same time. The softer side present in stable communities where the UPPs are present, the Pacifying Police Units, where they behave as something resembling proximity police forces, and a simultaneous urban warfare situation in the most complex slums, such as the Alemão and the Maré complexes that each have over 100,000 inhabitants. And by the way, they are both very close to the international airport and on the route to the hotels. This was also laid out clearly to me by Security Secretary José Mariano Beltrami, who told me that he indeed considers Rio de Janeiro to be in a situation of urban warfare. And I think it's important to take a moment to realize the importance of that, because it is a city facing a criminal challenge, and the top police officer says very clearly that it is in a situation of urban warfare. Although I must say that he made the caveat that that is specific in the large, densely inhabited slums, mega slums such as Alemão and Maré with over 100,000 inhabitants. So just to give you the context of this recent urban war that has been getting more intense in the past few years, the past year and a half, more accurately. The gangs explored very smartly the weak points of a public security force operating in a large and badly planned megacity such as Rio, in which not only the slums but overall in the city the streets tend to be very narrow. As the pacification program expanded and resources were stretched thin, the gangs started to return with guerrilla-style attacks, hit-and-run attacks, targeted killings, and intimidation of favela inhabitants. Of the 200 officers shot in supposedly pacified areas since the program started in 2008, 30% or 62 of them were injured just in the first 6 months of this year. The data on armed seizures is also telling. After gradually declining during the years after the pacification program began, seizures of small arms started climbing again last year, and 8,100 weapons were apprehended last year, 40% of which were heavy caliber weapons such as rifles and submachine guns. And a government document leaked to the press in April showed that, said that 13 slum communities were outside state control. So in summary, the gangs are striking back. And just at the moment when the pacification program had started to expand more aggressively to more slums. This can also be sensed from the increase in direct attacks against police bases, the renewed ability of these criminal groups, such as the Red Command and the Friends of Friends, Amigos dos Amigos, to intimidate communities, and the forced withdrawal by public forces from some unstable areas. So the main conundrum of Rio today is that urban warfare is infiltrating more and more aspects of life, territories previously considered pacified, and conflicting with government narratives of improved security. And perhaps even more important for the minds of the Cariocas is what is going to happen after the 2016 Olympic Games. Is this pacification program sustainable? That is a topic that is frequently on media debates and on the day-to-day chats of Cariocas. My friends who picked me up in the airport, we were talking about urban public security policies throughout the trip, and they didn't even know that I was there to research the Pacification program. So I have also asked this question about the sustainability of the program to some authorities in Brazil, including Secretary Beltrami, and their answer was a resounding yes. There is a slightly legalistic side to this answer, which is last March, the state government of Rio issued a decree turning the Pacification program into a state policy, política de Estado. What that means, according to these authorities, is that future governments will be legally bound to the continuation of the program. But there are several challenges, I think, for a real on-the-ground continuation of the program. Not that I don't think it will continue, but I think there are challenges that they will face to continue it. The most immediate one is finding resources amid the current recession faced by Brazil, in which the economy is forecast to contract by 1% this year. But also in the long term, the main question is how to sustain a labor-intensive process of urban territorial occupation, law enforcement, urban warfare capacity, and last but definitely not least, peace-building activities, development, social services, institutions, public transport, trash collection, electricity, water, all these things that many of the slums still today don't have, and they expect to have, or they are ceasing to have at some points because of gaps in this peace-building side of the Pacification program. So I'm drawing to a conclusion, and I don't want to end in an anticlimactic note. So I'll highlight how high the stakes are. First, I think that the Pacification program is seen as the only game in town. It was the first new idea that was sustainable, at least for more than a year, in Rio during the past decades. So I think that explains not only why it was hugely popular when it started in 2008, then for years after that, but also why it is still very popular, although less popular, today when it's facing so many challenges. Second, I think that the numbers are still pretty impressive. The number of homicides today in the municipality of Rio de Janeiro is 1/5 of what it was in 2007, pre-Pacification. So at the same time that people that live there, including many of my friends, are growing pessimistic and angry with security policies, there is a real preoccupation with finding ways to make this work in the long term. So I'll very cardly stop at this exact point of how to make it work.
Okay, thank you very much. Over to you, Christoph.
Thank you very much for coming here, and thank you, Antonio, for the possibility of speaking here at IISS. I'm going to talk to you about the participation of the armed forces within the Pacification program. So first of all, you should be aware that it is a constitutional task of the Brazilian armed forces to be deployed in so-called guaranteeing law and order operations. So the first democratic constitution after the transition from military rule established that the armed forces can be used in determined points of time, determined areas, limited points of time and limited areas within the state for assisting or replacing the police forces. This legislation has been expanded over the years since the transition, and it's mostly been former opponents of the military regime which have expanded the legal framework for this. So it's been Fernando Henrique Cardoso who's been sent to exile, formalized GLEO, guaranteeing law and order operations very much. And finally, under Lula da Silva, all armed forces branches gained police powers during GLEO operations. So, as Antonio said, public security in Brazil is mainly a state-led operation, and in order to bring the armed forces in, the state needs to attract the help from the federal government, which means the governor has to request a GLEO operation by stating that his own public security forces are not capable or not available for providing public security within this space. So this is, to a large extent, it's due to interpretation. So, for example, during the World Cup 2014, there was a preventive GLEO for all the areas where there were football games and where FIFA officials would be traveling. And you can doubt whether police forces would not have been able to do this. To talk more about the military participation in Pacification, there have been two major military participations, which is the Operação Arcanjo in the favela complexes of Alemão and Peña from 2010 to 2012, which lasted around 1.5 years, and in total 8,700 soldiers were deployed during this mission. which means that in an area of around 140,000 inhabitants, which makes up of one soldier and 112 citizens. Compared to that, the just recently ended Opération Francisco in the Complejo de Marais was much more labor intense. There were over 23,000 soldiers in a comparable point of time, which means that in an area with about the same number of inhabitants, there was one soldier on 42 citizens, which meant the citizens were subject to constant controls, constant searches, which did not actually help gaining the pacification program support by the whole of the population. One further difference is that the Operação in Alemão was much more a kind of peacekeeping, law and order keeping than is in Marais. The difference is that the gangs have been expelled in Alemão before, whilst in Marais the gangs stayed within the area, so the armed forces were facing 3 different drug gangs and a militia composed of former or on-duty, off-duty policemen and firemen, which again hold a certain part of the territory of Complejo de Marais. When you talk to soldiers, there is a difference, obviously, that members of the militia don't actively go into combat with the armed forces because it's a like-minded setting, whilst they face constant shootouts with drug gangs, especially the Terceiro Comando Puro and the ADA. Some have always compared these missions in Marais and Alemão as peacekeeping in favelas, inspired by the Brazilian peacekeeping effort in Haiti, where Brazil has constantly provided force commanders since 2004, has provided the bulk of troops, and has military spoken successfully expelled drug gangs from certain poorer slums in Port-au-Prince. So there is this famous Port-au-Prince-Rio connection because the Brazilian military police traveled to Haiti to study the tactics used by the armed forces in the slums of Port-au-Prince. So, for example, the armed forces used pontos fortes, strong points. They were conquering a gang-controlled area, expelled them, and then took hold of landmark buildings, strategically located buildings, established presence from there, and then held the territory by frequent patrols, which is a classical counter-insurgency strategy. And this strategy was later deployed in Alemão as well by the Brazilian military police. But currently in Marais, there are no pontos fortes anymore. The Marais is located next to a military reserve compound, so the army does their patrols from there. They don't enter the actual area Marais as they used to enter the Alemão. So they do have frequent patrols, but they don't establish a stronghold within the area anymore. And if you compare again the ratio of one soldier on 42 citizens in Marais, the UPP, the Pacifying Police Forces, which are supposed to replace the army at the moment in Marais, are going to be around 600 police officers, I think. And the military contingents were made up to 3,300 soldiers. So you see the problem in maintaining this kind of surge in a quite restricted area because it won't be possible to maintain this size of action. My point is that the experience in MINUSTA for the Brazilian army was not the origin of favela pacification tactics. The armed forces have done so before. In the 1990s, the armed forces have occupied favelas in Rio for 2 months, have occupied similar strategies and tactics. The difference is that nowadays there are doctrines. The army is writing down their experience, trying to disperse this experience among soldiers. And what I think is that peacekeeping in Haiti helped the armed forces in a public relations effort during the first pacification, particularly in Alemão. So soldiers were using light blue caps as they use in the peacekeeping forces, so they used light blue caps for the pacification force in Rio as well. So there was this kind of an effort to link these two operations together. But the last operation in Marais hasn't been that much of a public relations success anymore. There's not so much media and interest anymore, particularly as well because it's not as easy for journalists to come to the area as well. A further argument which is constantly used in the literature against using soldiers in public security is that soldiers are not trained for such tasks. But my point is, particularly in Brazil, one should differentiate a little bit, particularly if you see the military police and the UPP, which are often not very well prepared for their tasks, specifically for the community policing. There are many problems in terms of police education and training, and the armed forces are actually training police tasks, and not only training, they are having experience in police tasks. There used to be a specialized brigade for guaranteeing law and order operations, but this name has been abolished due to the fact that the Brazilian army tries to maintain the official picture that all troops can do the whole panoply of tasks. But in effect, troops that have been sent to Haiti are mostly troops that have been sent to Alemão and Maré and back, and then during the World Cup were on the streets for the GLO operations. So I've spoken to soldiers who have participated twice in the peacekeeping mission, twice in the Pacification, and then are frequently used when the Pope comes to visit Rio and again. So there is a certain group of soldiers which is becoming specialized in policing. If this is a desired process or if it's just happening automatically because of the commanders being asked to send experienced troops, that's a different matter, but it is a process. What I see much more problematic than non-adequate training is military jurisdiction. So a citizen in Maré, where the armed forces are replacing the police force, are subject to military jurisdiction in case they disobey or resist soldiers during any checks. So there are no body cams, usually there are no body cams, so then these citizens are brought to military jurisdiction, federal military jurisdiction, which is still a different issue than the state military legislation, where the judges are there are usually 5 judges and only 1 civilian which has actually a degree in law. The others are usually military officers which are more concerned with issues of hierarchy and obeying. So many citizens complain of not having the adequate rule of law processes at hand because they're just living in a certain area where the specification is taking place. The military is complaining that the rules of engagement are not strict enough. So in Alemão, the military had the possibility to search houses without any search warrant. They could enter any house during the Pacification. In Maré, this has only been the case in the initial stages, but now soldiers need to file a search warrant and often have to wait until sometimes up to 15 days until they get the search warrant, which in their perspective, makes it impossible to search for gang members which hide in some people's places. So, but it's a difficulty to strike the balance between the rule of law and the sufficient rules of engagement for the military. Some say it was a political issue just before the federal election to wind down this leeway for the troops, because it would have been bad publicity to have soldiers abusing their roles. But on the other hand, there are severe accusations of abuse, much more than during the Alemão mission this time. So, but still it remains a normative question if you would or should use the armed forces in internal tasks, but that's a different question. In terms of an outlook, what is going to happen after Maré and after Alemão? There has been a short-term military success in Alemão. The numbers of homicides have been brought down, but as I've said in the beginning, it's very difficult to maintain this level of security or presence of state agents. So in Alemão we have frequent shootouts again. The gangs are trying to reconquer the area, which cannot be countered by the UPP or the military police forces. So there is a question if the legacy of the military participation is actually worth the financial effort and the effort of legislation, etc. So I think the future of occupations by the military in Rio is rather unclear. There will be more GLO operations, as when the police strikes, the armed forces are sent to replace the police. Then during large events there's going to be a further military presence. But within the military there are reservations towards more participations in these missions, because it's a very exhaustive task. The armed forces go there for a couple of days, they stay there around the clock. So it's tiring for the soldiers, it's very expensive. If you compare that Brazil has sent around 28,000 soldiers to Haiti in over 10 years and has sent over 20,000 to Maré, it already means that there's a huge contingent as well tied to this kind of operation. Furthermore, in contrast to Alemão, Maré hasn't attracted that much positive public relations anymore, and for the armed forces, their image is hugely important. So they try to make their soldiers behave according to the rules because they want to present the best possible image. It not always takes place, but armed forces are very keen on maintaining their role as the third most trusted institution in the country. There have been media reports that the armed forces are considering occupying 4 more favelas in the run-up to the Olympic Games. So part of the Olympic Games are going to take place in a military area, in the Vila Militar, in Deodoro, in the north zone of Rio. And the military considers occupying 4 areas which are situated around this area in order to stop gangs from harming the image of the troops as well during the games, because for the armed forces it would ultimately be a PR disaster if within their own territory there would be major criminal activity during the World Cup. And I may close with that.
Christoph, thank you very much indeed. Well, an interesting, complex picture, on the face of it quite depressing, but as with all these things, important to put matters in context and look at where we are now relative to where we have been. I have to say, I think this is a fascinating model that really does put into stark relief the conundrums and the dilemmas that these urban insecurity situations do pose for policymakers in terms of long-term, real solutions rather than temporary patches. We've got just over 20 minutes for questions and comments, so I'm happy to take any questions anybody has got. I've got one myself, actually, that I'd like to put predominantly to you, I guess, Antonio, but to either of you. Where does the role of intelligence fit in all of this? Because it's always been a kind of convention and an accepted wisdom that intelligence in urban environments is actually easier than in rural environments. So, you've got more to work with, you've got more options, and it's much easier to sort of identify particular, very precise areas where things are happening and where focus needs to be presented. Did you talk to any of your interlocutors about this, and what did they say about it?
Well, the short answer is that I haven't focused so much on the role of intelligence, but I think when I said that the military police is not concerned with criminal investigation, it does have an intelligence component, and the federal police also has. So there is a lot of focus now on this issue of small arms and small arms trafficking. The public authorities have been very vocal about establishing better monitoring of how these arms come to Rio, and that being, in the context of this crisis that is going on now, that being a possible short to middle term, alleviation of the symptoms in Rio. So they did establish a special intelligence division to work on small arms trafficking to Rio, and they do use some technological tools like not exclusive tools, but for instance Google Earth has been extensively used for the occupation of the slums, and overall I think the entrance of the forces in the slums has been relatively successful. I mean, the Maré occupation, so the one that happened after Alemão, was announced, whereas the Alemão wasn't announced. Correct, right? Yeah. So during the Maré occupation, there was some combat. There were a few casualties, but overall, given the complexity of the area, I think the forces had a good awareness of their environment. I don't know to what extent the human intelligence component, especially for the armed forces in these mega slums, how that occurs. I don't know if Christoph has anything.
Yeah, just briefly. So the military police intelligence service still reports to the armed forces intelligence service as well. So the armed forces are very heavily engaged in intelligence. Particularly in Haiti, it was quite successful to pay informants as well. I'm not aware if the armed forces are paying informants within their own country. I doubt that they do it. There is a disque-denuncia where you can call and denounce operations of gangs, which arguably has been quite successful. So I'm not entirely aware to the intelligence component of to what extent it has helped, but compared to comparing Marais and Alemão, soldiers usually say that in Marais it was more difficult to get the intelligence information because the population usually is much more hesitant to work together with the armed forces in fear of retaliation afterwards. So, just...
No. Okay. Oh, yes.
Jay Barrow from the UK Amphibious Forces down in Portsmouth. But I'm interested in what success looked like. I mean, what's the end state in that region, and what's the acceptability of the criminal sort of elements, if you like, and the acceptance of the poverty in that area? And is there a time frame associated with any of that? Oh, 4 questions, sorry.
Yeah, okay, that's fine.
Well, I think there is an unspoken deadline for that, which is the security. I think the security secretariat structure will have some leadership changes in the near future because José Mariano Beltrami is there for about 7 years now, or possibly more. And he's been that long there because he wants to ensure the sustainability of the program. So he was very keen to highlight this new law that established the pacification as being a state policy. So I guess that the end policy, the end state would look a lot like the state of affairs back in 2010 and 11, when we still had problems. We still had, these slums that were, even some of the smallest ones were still under the control of criminal groups, but the slums that had a larger strategic effect over large areas of Rio were under stability and under the occupation, or whatever you choose to call it, under the presence of the security of the UPP, the security forces, be that military or military police, or actually the UPP units that are more trained to proximity policing. So I think that's the end state, as being optimistic about the program continuing and gaining more public support, and then in 5-10 years time that will be the end state. That is an optimistic assessment, I think, of what they expect to achieve in the short term. But I think the end state, as I said in my presentation, I think is of overall state of proximity policing, in which you don't need the military police to be deployed every week or every month. And nowadays it's being deployed every day, So I think that's the end state that they want in the long term. Acceptance of the criminal groups, I think, is that public support to the criminal groups. I think it's anecdotal, I think, the evidence. But for instance, during the 2013 public protest movement, there was talk. There were media reports and the intelligence gathering via radio and voice recordings of calls by the criminal groups of coordinating with some elements of community associations in the favelas to coordinate protests and at the same time attack UPP bases, attack the pacification bases in the slums. So from that, I would say that there is some level of popular support to criminal groups. But there's also, at the same time, it's difficult to dissociate that from the element of fear and the growing realization that the pacification is not able to enforce that presence that it was able to enforce before. So the criminals will be always there. So it's the same kind of counter-insurgency dilemma that you face in Afghanistan and Iraq, I think.
I mean, if I can just kick in there for a moment, in Northern Ireland in the 1970s, the talk for some period of time was about a, quote, acceptable level of violence, and an acceptance that you were not going to be able to eliminate violence from this particular conflict, but could you keep it within manageable bounds? Is there any sense of that within the Rio governing hierarchy?
The governing hierarchy, yes. I think they're very realistic about the limitations. As I said, Robson Rodriguez, who is the head of the military police, is very realistic. He says they're facing several challenges, but it's still it's sustainable, it's doable, but it's going to take a long time to actually have a significant improvement in violence. But I think the public opinion in general, the media, is very negative, and that is a big challenge for the authorities.
Christoph, do you want to say anything?
No, I think that was just...
Okay, gentleman at the back there, yeah, and then...
My name is Dr. Vinicius de Carvalho from King's College London also. I have some remarks that I would like to bring into discussion too, and first of all, I think it's very important to make a clear definition and differentiation between what is the operation of pacification and what is the public policy of pacification. These two elements, they are being discussed as the same thing, but they are very different. And in both of them, I would put some questions or observations to propose you some debates. The first of all is, in the case of Rio de Janeiro police specifically, we have military police that normally is not very well understood around the world, and Antonio did very well trying to clarify to us what's that. So military police in Rio de Janeiro is not deployed, it's constantly making patrol. Military police in Rio de Janeiro has authority around the area under the battalion area. So in Maré, we had a battalion there, the 22nd Infantry Battalion or Police Battalion. That's a police battalion inside the Maré favela and was always there for more than 20 years. So it's not that the police was being deployed to Maré, it was there already. And the question is, that's to Antonio, how to deal with a police who has inside its own institution several divisions. So we have the normal police, the blue police that are every day in the streets. We have the shock police, that's a special battalion for shock, for confrontation. We have UPP, and now we create another one that's called Pacification Police. So this Pacification Police is seen as a soft police or not brave enough, but at the same time with most of their commanders as veterans from UPP. So is that possible to change the mentality of a police using the commanders of that unities as former special operation commanders? That's one question that I would like to bring. And the second one is still related to that. Is not that a paradox to call the pacification as a politic of state? So pacification is a process. So if we arrive in peace, why we still need to have a pacification police? So it's not that a proof that it's just a marketing game to call this pacification as a politic of state, because thinking militarily, once it's pacified, it's pacified. But paradoxically, it's not pacified in the Brazilian case. And that's again the situation of operation that I moved to Christoph in this moment. The concept of pacification inside the armed forces was well defined and written down in a manual, a very controversial manual that called what was the term? To adverse force, referring to civilians. To the Brazilian civilians, so that provoked a lot of debate also. So the armed force is quite well concerned about that. And some questions or remarks that, in the case of both Alemão and Maré, shows very well how the difference was. You said about the mandate were different. In my point of view, Alemão was not a peacekeeping, exactly because they had opportunity and possibility to invade houses, to go into places without mandates for the justice. So in my point of view, was much more or a robust operation or a peace-building operation than a peacekeeping. We didn't have a peace agreement before. And another important point to be taken into consideration, in both were announced the invasion, the operation. Why? Because in both, the goal was not to get confrontation. So the announcement was to really make drug dealers leave the favelas before the operation to avoid confrontation. So all these peacekeeping, all these pacification operations are not to confront. The armed forces are not there to confront. It's a strong presence, signalizing force and authority in presence of the state. Worked well in Alemão because of the possibility of invade places or really act as a building. Okay, I know.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, 2 questions more or less to Antonio and 1 to Christoph.
Yeah, 2 very interesting questions. I spoke there with Pax Jones, who is the head of education at the Security Secretariat, which means basically that he's in charge of training and the doctrine of the military police and how to transmit that to the forces. And that is really one of the main challenges, and I didn't mention that in my presentation, and that's very important. Given this background, this history of interventionist, aggressive, robust police, how to make this transition to increase that proximity policing divisions in size, whereas you can't just train everything from the ground up. You have to transfer people from the other forces. But I guess that has to do with the capacity to stabilize, some of these of these areas. So I guess that will be a process that will take time, but we will also need to be accompanied by stabilization of areas in which this aggressive posture will not be so needed in a daily basis as it is now. But it's definitely something that they are looking at and trying to change this mentality of the officers. Policy of state, I guess it relates to the end state that was asked before. I mean, I guess it depends how you see, how you interpret how the Security Secretary sees the pacification program, because in the basics, I think it is seen as a policy of combination of a hard security approach, a hard security presence as a deterrence to any criminal groups that might want to penetrate that area, and a development, institutional presence in the slums. So I guess by saying that, they are recognizing that Rio, by its position in the littoral of the global south as a mega city, as being a hub for international trafficking, it is always going to be vulnerable to non-state criminal groups. So it is a recognition that we want to make this a policy of state, we want to make it permanent, and what it means is that we want to make a security presence, a credible security presence in the most vulnerable areas there permanent. So I guess that means that we recognize that the police forces, the military police forces, will never leave those areas. There's always going to have at least some security presence there in order to be a credible deterrence to these non-state groups. That's my interpretation.
Okay, right, Christoph. Banging of gongs and clashing of cymbals.
Yeah. So. With respect to the peacekeeping and peace enforcement, you could always say that peacekeeping in Haiti wasn't a peacekeeping mission either. So it's been a chapter. Yeah. But the public relations issue was trying to bring the peacekeeping to Rio, and it was a peace imposition, peace enforcement mission there, and it's been a peace enforcement mission both in Alemão and Marais as well. But I think the difference in the experience of the soldiers in Alemão and Marais was that after the initial peace enforcement and the gangs escaped, it much more resembled a patrolling of the area to keep the so-called established peace. Whilst in Marais, even though it was announced that the soldiers and the police are going to enter the area, the gangs never left. So they never established this degree of stabilization as they achieved in Alemão or as they achieved in Haiti. So to them, just recapping the experience of people I've talked to them, it's been a much more urban warfare, guerra no meio do povo action than it's been a policing, peacekeeping mission than it's been in Alemão and Haiti. So to them, Marais is the most difficult operation. They are facing shootouts almost every day. So it's imposing peace, trying to impose peace without having the established success. So in the official declarations of the armed forces, it has been a success in terms of giving the authorities the opportunity to come in the area. But I think in terms of sustainability of this success, I think the armed forces themselves are quite skeptical. I think that might be a short.
Right, thank you very much. Okay, we've got two questions in the front and then one at the back, and I'll take them all together because we're running out of time. Could I enjoin brevity on all of you, please? Start with you, sir.
Thanks, sir. Dean Scales, part of the Command Fit group from Portsmouth. Heard a lot, thank you very much for your briefs, but just heard a lot about kinetic action within the areas with the police, military police. I'll just be very interested to hear if there is anything within the non-kinetic area when it comes to information activity, media campaigns that are more embracing of the communities and using them to their benefit, as opposed to putting physical presence and weapons into an urban area.
Okay, thank you. Next, sir.
That was obviously my question.
Oh,
to kind of add on to that as well, you mentioned Northern Ireland. I'm just wondering if you decided, or the government decided there's going to be an urban war. Was there any decision, let's infiltrate the gangs, use this connectivity, Twitter, let's find out about them in that sense as well?
Mm-hmm. Okay, and sir, at the back.
I'm Gabriel Sylvester, PhD student in urban planning at UCL. So my question is actually to Antonio. Question is, from which scale do you think shall we read the results of UPP? And my interest in this question is actually from two observations. So the first one is what has been made clear in your presentation by comments from Michael and Vinicius here, is that the goal of the operation is not about dismantling networks, right? It's one about territorial conflicts. So in that sense, it displaces these networks elsewhere. And what we've been observed in the past couple of years is an increase in criminal statistics elsewhere in the metropolitan region, particularly in Niterói and São Gonçalo across the bay. So the second point, which is related to that, is about the unequal geography of these UPPs. And actually this discussion about the intelligence, what actually informs these operations. A point that was taken from the study of Ignacio Cano that you cited is that doesn't seem to have a logic based on criminal statistics about which is the next site for the operation. It seems to be very well connected with the hosting of many events, because this geography is overwhelmingly concentrated in the upper class areas in the south end, or in strategic areas next to the stadium of Maracanã, where there's a security belt, and next to the airports.
Okay, right. So non-kinetic lines of operation, and is this simply whack-a-mole? Who wants to go first? Christoph?
Just to the on the part of the military is traditionally doing social civic interactions with citizens, but in terms of Marais and Alemão, the armed forces don't want their soldiers to establish long-term ties with the population, because the problem of the military police oftentimes is that problem of corruption, which originates from longest-term established ties with drug gangs, because drug gangs know the police officer is going home and is living over there. So they don't want the armed forces to have this intense contact, and I think the non-kinetic part is going to be left to the UPP or the UPP Social in the police.
Do you have anything to say on that?
On that, very briefly, and again anecdotal, because I think it varies in time and space, the level of public support, public engagement. The Disque Denúncia, the telephone number that people use to, is a very widely used tool in Rio de Janeiro, so there is a lot of human intelligence going on. I visited the Dona Marta slum that was the first one to be pacified back in 2008. It's small, it's a very good basket case study because it is small, it is in the south zone, it is easily visited, and it was it is still the most stable one, but 2 weeks after I left, they had the first shooting in 7 years. So I'm citing this to say that the engagement of police, at least the police component with the population, tends to be better, tends to be more of proximity policing in the small, stable slums. The conundrum, the problem comes with the fact that now the number of small, stable slums are diminishing. It's diminishing. So how do you pursue this kind of proximity policing approach with the diminishing number of stable slums. So that is a challenge, and that is what they want to calibrate. So you're absolutely right that the aim is not to dismantle criminal networks. They made it very clear, the public authorities say that all the time. It's not to dismantle the criminal groups, not to stop drug trafficking, but to stabilize territories in order for institutions to go in. So I think it is a very nice addition to the previous questions about the end state, about the paradox of the policy of state, or that being a state policy, in which the end result should be, a public force that is able to enforce state authority. So it is a policy aiming at the presence of the state rather than in the responding precisely to the moves of a non-state actor. The choice of the slums is a hugely politicized and controversial topic in Brazil, because of course you cannot do pacification in all the slums of Rio. There are some counts, I'm not sure if Christian has that precisely, but over 1,000 slums officially in Rio. Many of them are very small. They are parts of larger slums. I mean, it's technical municipality, urban policy kind of definition, but right now we have 38 areas that are on the slum, but for instance the Alemão and Maré, they have several slums within them, so they're considered one complex of slums, but they have several smaller slums within them. So it is complicated, and I guess you have to start somewhere, and what the authorities would say, or they did say in some way to me, is that you are choosing the larger slums where the criminal groups have a historical presence of as a hub for coordination, for drug trafficking, for stockpiling of weapons. And again, I think a very non-explored aspect of pacification is the effect it has on the immediate vicinity, in which this can also be a component for the choice of the venues. And I think Maré and Alemão were chosen not just because they are big and dangerous, but because they are very near the international airport. They are near the avenues that ran. They are next to the avenues that run to the south zone. But again, it's hugely complex, and you're absolutely right. There are the rich areas, the areas that the slums that affect the rich areas are prioritized. So.
Well, thank you very much. 'Twas ever thus, I guess. Well, I'm sorry, we're going to have to bring this to an end. And if anybody had a question pending that I wasn't able to take, I apologise for that. I don't think we've really cracked this, but it's been an interesting exercise in looking at some of these problems and opened up some lines of thinking, lines of inquiry about the inherent intractability of issues of this kind, and what are the aims and objectives. Manage things within tolerable levels, break down the networks, drive them out. What are the long-term, realistic, long-term, achievable outcomes in situations of this kind? Clear, there's a lot more work, a lot more research that can usefully be done here, and we certainly plan to focus some attention in IISS on this. But I'd like to just, firstly thank you all for making it in, notwithstanding the tube strike, but could I please ask you particularly to thank our speakers for some very stimulating inputs. Thank you.